everyone. Welcome to this event on Voices That Matter, Kurdish Women at the Limits of Representation in Contemporary Turkey. This is our last event of the term for the Middle East Centre's event series, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Great to see you here for this. My name is Robert Lowe. I'm the Deputy Director of the Middle East Centre, and I'm co-convener of the Kurdish Studies series at the LSE Middle East Centre, of which this event is part. The running order for proceedings is very straightforward. Our speaker will talk for roughly 20 minutes or thereabouts, and then we'll have good time at the end for questions, comments, and discussion in this nice, intimate, friendly setting that we have. We'll keep it quite informal and give you all a chance to participate after the presentation. We'll finish by 7 o'clock. The event will be recorded, and we will maybe be taking pictures throughout the event as well. There are some leaflets you may have seen on the desks about the book. You can buy it at a discount from the press directly. So, a very warm welcome to Marlene Schäfers. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, for travelling over. She's not had the most straightforward journey on the Eurostar, so we're just pleased she made it at all. It seems to be almost touch and go at some point. Marlene is Assistant Professor in Cultural Anthropology at Utrecht University. Her research focuses on the impact of state violence on intimate and gendered lives, the politics of death and the afterlife, and the intersections of affect and politics. She specialises in the anthropology of the Kurdish regions and of modern Turkey, and her first monograph is this wonderful book, Voices That Matter, Kurdish Women at the Limits of Representation in Contemporary Turkey, University of Chicago Press. This investigates Kurdish women's struggle for voice in contemporary Turkey. Her second research project, presumably underway, current at the moment, is focusing on politics of afterlives in the Middle East through an ethnographic investigation into how the dead acquire powerful afterlives as martyrs, saints, and heroes. The project conceptualizes afterlives as a central site for the exercise, nourishment, and sustenance of sovereignty. So we look forward to the book on that and having you back in a few years' time for another round. Thank you, Anne. I'll hand over to you for the presentation. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for the very kind introduction and for having me here, for inviting me. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here to present the book that just came out. Well, it's almost a year now that it's been out. To present it here at the Middle East Center, and also really an honor and a pleasure to be part of the Kurdish Studies event series, which is really great to see that that's taking shape and happening here. All the more so, I'm also the managing editor of the Kurdish Studies Journal, so it's really great to see kind of how the field is taking shape, thanks to initiatives here and elsewhere. So yeah, really thank you for having me here. So what I want to do in the next around 20 minutes or so is to give you a short introduction, essentially sort of to the book, outlining briefly what I'm hoping to achieve with the book, what are some of the key arguments, and essentially how I've approached this question of voice in the book. And hopefully also play you a couple of examples to give you actually a sense of how some of those voices sound like. Raise your voice, be vocal, speak up. These are all injunctions that I'm sure many of us will be familiar with, suggesting that having a voice is crucial for asserting presence and agency. These kind of injunctions percolate through much contemporary public discourse. In northern Kurdistan too, where I've carried out the ethnographic research for Voices That Matter, these kind of tropes are very familiar terrain. So against a historical backdrop that has seen the Kurdish voice systematically denied, silenced, and violently disciplined, this idea of raising one's voice carries a lot of moral weight as an index of political resistance and defiant self-assertion. And for Kurdish women, tropes like being vocal and speaking up carry this kind of extra gendered layer of meaning as they signal a challenge towards patriarchal logics that we can see both in local communities but also coming from state politics. And so in this context, having a voice and raising it in public are really gestures that come with very high hopes attached. Voices promise participation, empowerment, representation, voices promise to finally be heard, to make a difference, and to matter. But the voice obviously constitutes this kind of powerful trope promising, collective recognition, personal empowerment, not just in northern Kurdistan. In fact, in many parts of the world, we can see that marginalized, disadvantaged, and dispossessed subjects are regularly encouraged to raise their voices as a route to emancipation and self-assertion. So many feminist, development, and human rights activists celebrate really the coming to voice of the marginalized as a means to achieve participation and to gain agency. And if we think about democratic political structures, we see that they're similarly founded on the idea that political decision-making should rely on citizens voicing their thoughts and opinions in the public sphere. And in fact, in quite a few languages, to vote in an election and voice are etymologically related words, as is the case in Kurdish. Dengdan, to vote and to give your voice. So modern representational politics in this way tie political and personal agency, recognition and participation to having a voice, and invest the voice with immense emancipatory promise, political value, and ethical weight. And so in the book, what I really tried to do is to kind of examine some of the consequences of this contemporary valorization of the voice through an ethnography of Kurdish women singers and their struggle to raise their voices in contemporary Turkey. So if the voice really promises empowerment, agency, representation, then what happens when the marginalized actually raise their voices in the hope of seeing these promises fulfilled? That's kind of the central question animating the project. And the book is an attempt at finding answers to this question. It's based on 18 months of field research that I carried out in 2011 and 12 in and around the majority Kurdish inhabited town of Van, which you can see here, in eastern Turkey, followed by numerous shorter stays since then. And so the book's point of departure is a frustration, really, with discourses that I'm sure many of you will be very, very familiar with, these kind of discourses that portray Kurdish women or Muslim women of the Middle East more broadly as lacking in voice, as silenced, and therefore politically and socially suppressed. So this image of the silenced Muslim woman, her voice seemingly curtailed by religious doctrine, retrogressive tradition, and male authority is very pervasive. I think we all know that. It informs not only mainstream discourse in many European and American contexts, but it has also long echoed through the narratives of secular liberal elites in the Middle East. And in the Middle East often then also works to delineate, as it does in contexts in Europe and America, so it delineates progress from tradition, modern from backwards, agency from suppression, and often in ways that sustain persistent class and racial divides, as we can see also in the Turkish context. And at the same time, it's an image that has not gone unchallenged, this image of the suppressed, silenced, quote-unquote, Muslim woman. So feminist scholars have invested much energy in confronting simplistic ideas about passive and submissive Muslim women, and they've often done so by seeking to uncover Muslim women's voices as they reverberate, for instance, in domestic settings or in all-female and private settings. Searching for its presence rather than pointing to its absence, in such feminist scholarship too, the voice stands as a symbol for agency, empowerment, and resistance. So as much as these two narratives of the silenced and suppressed Muslim woman on the one hand, and the Muslim woman speaking back to resist on the other hand, as much as these two narratives seem to be kind of radically opposed to each other, over the course of researching this book, I've come to realize that they are in some ways two sides of the same coin. Because both narratives, both of these assertions are based on the assumption that having a voice constitutes a reliable indicator of somebody's agency and empowerment, and that being silenced is therefore an indication of political or social suppression. And so for this to make sense, both of these narratives further have to assume that voices should somehow quite naturally indicate the desires, wishes, and opinions of those who pronounce them. Because only once we assume as much can we understand the audibility of literal voices as a sign of personal empowerment and their silencing as a sign of oppression. Now, researching and writing this book over several years has made me realize that voices do not, in fact, in any inherent or universal way represent their bearer's interiority or self or identity. So in the Kurdish context where I conducted my research, voices often became detached from the subjects who uttered them, expressing not the emotions of the personal self, but those of others, for example, or featuring like a service that could be commissioned and exchanged, rather than being tied to a singular individual and their intimate experiences or opinions. So can we understand such voices through a framework of silence and oppression, voice and agency? And what might we learn from these kinds of voices more broadly about contemporary politics of voice and the kinds of subjects they shape? These are some of the questions that I ask in the book, and I try to find answers through, as I said, this ethnography of Kurdish women singers, who are known as dengbej, a Kurdish term that refers to performers of oral histories and other forms of sung narrative. Sometimes they're also called bards in English, or oral historians. And so when I arrived in Van, as you can see here in the image, in Eastern Turkey for my doctoral fieldwork in the summer of 2011, a group of women dengbej, of these singers, that you can see here, had just set up an association. This is the space of the association they had set up with the aim of supporting Kurdish female singers and artists. And this was the first association of its kind in Turkey and probably in Kurdistan, in the entire region. And it was quite a significant step because historically, Kurdish dengbej, these all performers who have acquired public prominence, have almost exclusively been men. There have been some exceptions to this, but the vast majority of these Kurdish singers that we know from public performances have been men. But here then was this group of middle-aged to elderly, feisty and outspoken Kurdish women who were intent on making their voices heard, no matter the consequences. And as Gazin, one of the founders of the association and one of my main research collaborators, told me, our voices can no longer be hidden. So this was kind of the motto that animated really this endeavor. But this engagement by these Kurdish women was not without risk. So in Kurdish communities, voices function as status indicators along both gendered and generational lines, and it can be considered immodest for women's voices to be heard in gender-mixed publics. And performing in public was in fact often met with quite severe opposition from families, kin, and wider society for women. So nearly all of the women singers that I encountered during my fieldwork had at some point in their lives faced forms of rejection, restriction, and also outright physical violence from sometimes within their extended families or their broader social networks, including also Gazin, as you can see, whom you can see here on the slide. And so in addition, so on the one hand, we have these kind of gender-specific restraints on the voice, but in addition, there are also political risks. So since the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923, the Kurdish voice has come under intense scrutiny as an object of prohibition, denial, and violent assimilation. Until the 1990s, the Kurdish language was banned in Turkey, and Kurdish existence was denied. It was prohibited to publish or to write in Kurdish. You also couldn't perform music in Kurdish, and there were even periods when you could be fined just for speaking Kurdish in public. So really heavy kind of suppression of the Kurdish voice. And while some of these restrictions have been lifted over the last 2 or 3 decades, the Kurdish voice continues to be an object of suspicion in Turkey. Speaking, singing, or writing in Kurdish is no longer officially prohibited, but doing so is quickly perceived as indicating a lack of political loyalty, which means that carrying out any cultural activities in Kurdish remains very precariously perched at the limits of Turkey's national consensus. And so that leads to people like Gazin, for instance, having to deal with a number of court cases, and a lot of other Kurdish cultural producers keep sort of running up against these limits of Turkish tolerance, so to speak. And so for Kurdish women, in light of these constraints, was an endeavor that held both these gendered and political risks. And yet, the women at the Women's Singers Association in Van displayed remarkable perseverance, really very stubbornly insisting on raising their voices despite all opposition, and radiating also a remarkable and very resolute optimism. Kurdish women's voices, they were certain, could no longer be hidden. As women and as Kurds, they had a story to tell, an existence to prove. Time had come for them to raise their voices, they were sure. And so crucially, as they insisted on their right to raise their voices in public, the women at the Singers Association appealed to this very familiar logic, which locates the value of a voice in its power to represent the self and identity of those pronouncing it. They felt their voices were valuable and ought to be heard because, as Dengbej, their voices uniquely represented Kurdish culture and traditions, and from this, neglected female perspective at the same time. And so in my analysis, I too focused for really quite a long time on how the voices of my interlocutors, of these Kurdish women singers, expressed the identity and the interiority of subjects who had long been denied any historical agency, and how these voices therefore kind of symbolized Kurdish women's resistance vis-a-vis both patriarchal and colonial regimes of power and domination. So I was very much focused on this idea of, the voice as a kind of, expression of agency, empowerment, resistance, and so on. But over the course of my field research, I witnessed that voices had effects, not just because of what they said or what they symbolized, but because of how they sounded. So the vocal practices that unfolded in the rooms of the Women's Singers Association suggested that in this context, voices did a whole range of other things apart from, or in addition to, functioning as expressions of their enunciator's self-identity and agency. So as I spent many hours during my fieldwork listening to the voices of Dengbej singing about experiences of hardship, pain, and tragedy in this small association tucked away in a dark passageway in Van's city center, which you can see here, I observed how voices had the power to really viscerally affect their audiences because of how they reverberated, how they lamented, how they wailed. These were voices capable of moving listeners to tears, making them shiver, or as local idioms put it, burning their hearts, thanks to the trembling of a vowel or the weight of a poetic image. They provided a means to express not only one's own sorrows, but also that of others, making pain travel between bodies and beyond the boundaries of individual subjects. These voices, I realized, could not simply be reduced to their symbolic value as, signs of women's resistance against patriarchal restraint or against political repression. And eventually it became clear to me that instead of assuming that voices somehow naturally represent subjects and ask on what terms they do so, I would instead have to ask how voices shape the very subjects that they appear to be merely expressing. And so ultimately this perspective has allowed me to move from the question of whether Kurdish women do or do not have voice, whether they are, silenced or empowered, to asking how voices have to sound like in order to become intelligible as symbols of agency and empowerment in the first place, and what the effects of such a framing are. So one of the arguments, so it took me really quite a while to kind of make this shift, and then one of the arguments that, eventually once I began looking at this question from a different perspective, what I sort of came to realize is that voices only matter in the contemporary world if they can be understood as voices that represent their bearer's self and agency. But not all voices do that equally well. So if we look at traditional Kurdish oral repertoires, the kind of repertoires that these dingbayers sing, we actually encounter a cultural poetics where it's quite difficult to reliably map voices onto selves. So in these repertoires, voices circulate kind of independently from their enunciators, expressing less the sentiments of those who pronounce them than the sentiments of others. They often deliver really fragmented narratives that don't have a clear subject at the center, and they prioritize conventional rather than idiosyncratic or unique forms of expression. So not inherently tied to their bearers, these voices can also be lent out to others as a service. So several of the women singers that I worked with had actually composed songs about the kind of grievances and hardship of others on demand, and delivered them then to their clients via cassette tape or USB sticks, or sometimes also on cell phones. So voices and selves are not very reliably linked in Kurdish oral culture, which means that it's very hard for these voices to matter in this metaphorical sense, because they cannot in any straightforward way be understood as an index of the will and agency of their speakers, because they represent not sort of in a straightforward way the self of that speaker. So it sort of becomes difficult to read them as these expressions of empowerment and agency or resistance. But what I also noticed, so this is a kind of traditional repertoires, but what I also noticed is that in some of the more recent repertoires performed by the women that I worked with, the sonic form of the voice actually changes quite radically. So I'll spare you the kind of musicological details here, which it took me a lot of time to kind of get into. But essentially what I observed is that in many of these newer pieces, this kind of newer repertoires that women were experimenting with, we see that the acoustics of the voice becomes a lot simpler than in these traditional repertoires. So in these traditional repertoires, you have a lot of vocal elaboration. And in some of the newer pieces, there's much more an attention to the meaning of the words rather than focusing on this vocal elaboration. The narrative is also no longer marked by a sort of a fragmented intermingling of different voices and personas, but instead there's sort of a singular subject and the feelings of that singular subject that dominate narratives of some of these newer repertoires with much more frequency. And to give you an example of how, a contrast of how sort of more traditional repertoires sound like and how some of the newer stuff sounds like, I'm going to play you, and hopefully it's going to work. I'm first going to I'll play you a video, which I think there's a problem that the sound and the video don't quite overlap. Sorry about that. But you can just listen to the sound. And this is a piece about the Van earthquakes of 2011. But I just want you also, I'm sure some people here understand Kurdish, but even if you don't, just to kind of follow a bit the kind of acoustics of it.
ويدا برامي بازم برامي بايزة من دما بلا خند داي ولا من كربو كارو بارز بستاني لسر سر مدقريا عورك رشة طاري عوري عرض جان داي دوراني ويدا دما من برا خند دال عرض اردي شواني تمام بقنداني ولا تخرابي الما بينان وخانيان ومالان ولا زاريت تزارو كان قريت تشدايك وباباني هوارت تمام وصان دايل مبويا فرماني.
So this is the kind of more traditional style. And now I'll play you another song by the same singer, Gazin, which is, I think you will notice, is really, really very different in terms of style.
Ez gazineyim, ezden bejeyim, ez ne kereyim, ez ne geceyim. Derdi deliye xud bejeyim, kesek dengeyim nabizeyim, kesek dengeyim nabizeyim. Ez gazina ya dil birine, dilo hena ya tji khwine, weke khaje weke zine, لبر zulma ya düşmene, ardek nema ya ez biçim.
Yeah, that's what we hear. But I think you notice the kind of, very different acoustics. And so in the book, I go into some more detail, but essentially what I'm trying to show is that these kind of classical repertoires, in some sense, kind of detach voice from self, in the sense that there's no clear overlap of, whatever the voice says and the kind of self that is being expressed. Whereas in these newer repertoires, the kind of second example, the two actually, the voice and the self sort of increasingly overlap, such that the voice becomes much more a kind of expression, really, of the interiority, the identity, and the self of the person pronouncing it. And I believe that the argument that I put forward in the book is that these transformations can be read as a response to what I call the representational imperative extended by contemporary politics of voice, which can only understand voices as, the sign of empowerment and emancipation if these voices reliably represent the thoughts, feelings, and desires of those who pronounce them. For voices to matter, in other words, they need to become audible as representative of self and identity, and that has effect on how these voices actually sound. So we can actually see how soundscapes are changing in response to that. That's the argument of the book, at least. But once a voice is primarily a means to express one's own self, rather than, say, someone else's worries or thoughts or feelings, there remains very little space to hide. This means that contemporary politics of voice carry specific risks for women in particular. So as I mentioned earlier, in Kurdish communities, it can be considered immodest for women to raise their voices in public. And historically, women have circumvented these barriers by singing anonymously or by using their own voice to express the feelings or experiences of another. But if only a voice that sincerely expresses the self is a voice that matters politically, then suddenly anonymity becomes more of a drawback than an advantage. So in the book, I trace how the women at the association, the women that you can see here, how they encountered these new kinds of challenges, navigating a terrain where the promises that voices evoked, promises of social and political recognition, but also of fame and financial profit, where these promises came paired with considerable risks of patriarchal backlash and social rejection. And I think this perspective allows us to see contemporary contestations around Kurdish women's voices, including the disciplining and the violence experienced by many of my interlocutors, not as sort of a remnant of some retrogressive, backward, or tribal culture, but rather as a consequence of how novel aspirations towards public voice challenge long-standing patriarchal concerns about female exposure in gender-mixed spaces. And what I also observe is that these contestations around voices are increasingly framed through a language of property. So while Kurdish oral repertoires used to be communally owned and genealogically transmitted in the past, voices are today increasingly thought of as belonging to specific individuals or collectives. They have become something that one can have, in the sense of having a voice, or even own. But once voices can be owned, they can also be stolen. And the women I worked with were, in fact, increasingly worried about how their voices might be unrightfully appropriated by others, including, for instance, music producers, but also male dingbase. So there was a lot of feeling on the part of women dingbase that male dingbase were trying to steal their voices, and they were kind of appropriating their fame. And it led to some of them even turning to copyright law in order to gain legal protection for their voices. So, you know, having a voice, this kind of term that we use so easily, constitutes actually a very laborious and contested achievement rather than this kind of self-evident fact. So you have to invest in making voices belong to certain people, for instance, through copyright law. So to kind of, you know, sum up, I think Kurdish women's voices clearly have never been as audible as they are today. But the book shows that this kind of audibility is no straightforward or simple path to liberation. Where voices are increasingly read as representing those who bear them, raising one's voice sustains not only hopes and desires, but also engenders new contestations and conflicts, risks and vulnerabilities. This is not to deny the effectiveness or necessity of women taking up and asserting their voices, not at all. But I think we may need to think much more carefully about how audibility and, you know, gaining a voice in the literal sense can also engender vulnerability alongside all these, you know, promises. And I think we may need to also think carefully about the forms of solidarity that we may need to develop and nurture in response to these kind of vulnerabilities. So stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful to hear your presentation. Thank you. Lovely of you to share your research with us. It was very compelling, very passionately and cleverly argued. Thank you so much for that. It was lovely to see the singers as well and to hear them make such a difference. Gazine looks like quite a character. It was very sad to read. She's no longer with us anymore. That's very sad. Point in your book to read that she's no longer here. I love the phrase "the burning of the heart." That stands out as well. It makes shedding tears seem rather feeble by comparison as an idiom. So I think we need to adopt it into English, and I'll be using it from now anyway. I will open up to the floor now. We have about 20 minutes for comments, questions. Please fire away anything you'd like to ask or share with Marlene. Please introduce yourself, give us your name and any affiliation if you wish as well. But it'd be lovely to know who you are before you make an intervention. If you wish to say anything, please just raise your hand. Thank you, please.
Hi, my name is Ardan Sinici. I'm actually from Van. My mum is from Van and my dad is from Ahmed, which is Diyarbakir. This isn't really a question because I've actually not read your book, but I'm really looking forward to it. But I've also heard Gazine's book that you worked on. I'm actually really interested in that book actually, but I really want to read this book as well. So I just wanted to say thank you for traveling to Van and, you know, taking such a big task, and it's not easy. I know because I travel there as well, you know, navigating in a really cultural area where woman is like, you can hardly see women. It's always in the kitchen or doing some work. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, yeah. Maybe just to respond, so because you mentioned the second book, I can maybe just briefly explain that. So Gazine, maybe you can put her here on the screen, who was the founder of this association. She passed away very suddenly in 2000, when was it, 18? And so she was extremely vocal. I mean, she was somebody, you know, our voices can no longer be hidden. She was very much invested in this idea of making herself heard. So she, her family wanted to have a kind of legacy, and I was struggling, and they approached me to sort of produce something, but I was struggling with this idea of, you know, this woman was so vocal, how do you, like, you know, how, I felt like I'm not entitled to kind of tell her story because she had, you know, invested so much in trying to make herself heard. So for the book, what we ended up doing, actually, we did it together with a friend, is more that we actually went and collected all instances of her voice in the sense that we went after all kinds of interviews she had given to all kinds of different outlets, interviews that I had, you know, recordings I had made, and we kind of curated, and we also talked to her friends, family, other people that she knew. And so it was more actually, the book is more kind of a curation of these different kind of voices. The idea is really to let her tell her own story through her own voice, rather than, kind of, because her voice was, so much out there. So, it felt sort of not really our place or my place to kind of do that work instead of her. So, yeah, and the book is both in Kurdish and in Turkish. So the hope is also that, because she also, she expressed herself both in Kurdish and in Turkish. So the idea was to kind of give a stage to that. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam, for your comment, please.
Thank you very much, Marlene. My name is Mashuk from Royal Holloway. Congratulations again on the book. I'm very excited to read it, but from your presentation I have some scattered ideas that I will try to kind of turn into some form of questions. So this division that you talk about, like Dengbej traditionally expressing something, the story of the others, more in the anonymized form, and in the example of Gazan, for example, as Gazanım, as Dengbejim, as Negejim, right? As Negerim, as Negejim. Is this somehow related to the gendered aspect of this? Like, how do you see this in the broader spectrum of several other people that precedes Gazan, for example, like Aisha Shan or Maryam Khan? Did they have to own their voice because they were denied, and did they had to kind of bring the self as a result of these conditions? I think that is one question. The second question is, so at least in my observation from other Dengbej houses, mostly male-dominated in Ahmed, I have also observed how kind of that socio-spatial conditions actually change the performance, the style, and the context. Obviously, like, in a village room, in the presence of a patron, a performance that would last 2-3 hours, and now it is catered to probably a commodified cultural practice in many ways for tourists or visitors that needs to be condensed into 5, 10, 15 minutes of a performance, regulated around kind of an orderly situation, because several Dengbejs are present and no one, like, kind of the management doesn't want some of them or one of them dominate, and things like that, So I wonder, like, how this transition, this change, urbanization in the Kurdish space, for example, have affected the performance, the context, and this kind of things. And a third question, I am curious to know what the current state of the Dengbej houses are, and maybe a little bit if you can reflect on your field work and if its aftermath. And if there are other Dengbej houses, the women Dengbej houses exist. I think there is one in Batman as well, or there was. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mashuk. There to tackle.
Yeah, thanks. Great questions. Thank you so much. The first question about sort of what about these kind of examples of female singers from the past, and sort of how does the gender aspect play into that? I haven't kind of systematically analyzed the kind of corpus of the kind of historical corpus of female Dengbej. That would actually be an interesting exercise. But my sense is that so I've looked at Aisha Shan's stuff, and my sense is that Aisha Shan really begins to experiment a lot with different kind of repertoires that are much more focused on kind of telling the self, telling the story of the self. So you see, I feel that with like Maryam Khan, for instance, it's much more in a kind of traditional style. Whereas with Aisha Shan, you really see that she starts experimenting with also, she kind of, you see a change in how reported speech, for instance, is used. So you no longer have all this expression of Mugo as the BIM, this kind of, these kind of reported speech expression, which I think really contribute to detaching voice from self. But you have a much more kind of straightforward expression of, I am this and that, I feel like that and that, my heart is burning, but without this kind of, reported speech element, which kind of would detach voice from self in some ways. So I really see that with Aisha Khan, she definitely experiments with that a lot. So I think there is a shift probably somewhere around in the second half of the 20th century, where I think these kind of new experimentations with how to express yourself become a lot more frequent and a lot more attractive, because I think it has to do with new ideas about what a subject is and what it means to express yourself through your voice, and new ideas about female assertiveness and female presence, which I think were just not quite there previously. So that is, but I think this is would be a great topic to explore much more systematically, actually, and look at, kind of the historical changes in these kind of corpora over time. So that's kind of, I hope that kind of answers a bit your first question. Regarding the Danish houses and the change of performance and style, yes, definitely. I mean, that's definitely happening. Although I think what's important to mention here is that these ladies, they actually were not, this was not an initiative run by the municipality. So they were kind of, setting this up on their own. So it was never quite as institutionalized as has happened with these others. So these Danish houses have basically been funded by Kurdish municipalities that have kind of, created these institutions and put these singers sort of on a stage, being like, you guys now, you are our you represent our tradition. And they often perform for tourists, but also all kinds of other people. And they also, I think, just hang out and have fun. But so this was a bit different because it didn't have the kind of institutional backing, which meant they had a constant lack of money. And so in that sense, I think the kind of, there was, definitely, obviously, they had aspirations to become institutionalized, but I think some of the performance styles was probably less influenced by that because there was simply not the institutional backing to do it. So they had like this tiny space, somewhere in the city center. It was usually cold and, so, it wasn't the kind of same institutional setup as these kind of bigger places in Ahmed or elsewhere. But I do think that definitely urbanization has a huge effect on these performances. So also the women who came there was a mix, people who were coming from villages and people who were staying in the city. And I definitely think that for women who had been, not just urbanization, but also just exposure to the Kurdish movement, to the political movement, made a whole difference in how women would approach their own art, let's say, that they would see it much more as a kind of both political and gendered endeavor, as something that they did because they were resisting as Kurds and because they were trying to make their voices heard, as women. And so Gazin, for instance, she was very close to the Kurdish movement, and so I think a lot of her ideas about, the necessity for women to raise their voices, for Kurdish women to raise their voices, came also from the Kurdish political movement. So this is definitely a huge factor in kind of, pushing these voices to the foreground, but also pushing a very specific idea about voice as agency and empowerment, and which I think can be somewhat restrictive in approaching what these voices actually do. So that's that, and then the current state. For those of you familiar with the region, not surprisingly perhaps, the association is no longer alive. Partly because after the failed coup attempt, these kind of associations were all shut down, and it just became extremely difficult to do any kind of cultural activity in Kurdistan. And then also with Gazin passing away, she was really the driving force behind it. So with her, passing away, it kind of all fell apart a little bit. I'm still in touch with some of the women who were involved. And I know that some of them went, by the municipality, the Van municipality had their own language house. Some went there to sing with the men, although they always complain about how the men are nasty and just make them, brew the tea.
Did he sing alongside the men?
So that's the idea, but...
men allowed, would they?
Sort of, but not, there's some conflicts around that. So that's when some of them have just stopped doing this. So at the moment there's not much going on. so no longer this kind of public investment. People are obviously still singing in their houses and stuff, but I think it's kind of floundered, which I think also tells you a lot about how what I'm talking about is very specific to this, specific moment in which I did my fieldwork, which was the peace process. If you think about it in terms of voice, it was a moment, I think, when voices that had been suppressed for a long time became audible in new ways, and in some ways was kind of a window that has since kind of shut down. So these voices have kind of retreated, I think, into private and intimate spaces where now they are no longer really audible. So yeah, thanks for that.
Sure. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Dilan. I've just met Marlene a week ago in Hamburg thanks to a Kurdish music festival, and my father is a Dengbesh, he was performing there. So even for me, as a daughter of a Dengbesh father and a Dengbesh mother, there are like lots of new perspective thanks to this brilliant presentation. And I'm just still trying to contemplate your kind of how you put others, and Kurdish communities is very communal, and even for me, I'm from Şırnak, it's really difficult to separate the individual experience from the communal experience because of the oppression mostly. And also I understand the traditional themes, and you just mentioned that these Dengbesh are also historians. I think it was for them maybe kind of a communal social duty to convey that experience. So maybe that's the reason. And I'm really I understand that you perceive this new transformation as a form of progress, which I'm with you on this, but I'm also wondering whether this is a form of kind of disintegration, and does it show something else to us in terms of being like a community? And yeah, thank you so much. I'm sure the book is brilliant, and I'm looking forward to read it.
Thanks, Ilan. Yeah, I think it's a spot-on question in the sense that I think in some ways, I guess, it's complex. I mean, I don't know if that's not a very satisfying answer to these kind of questions, but in the sense that I think you're completely right, in the sense that my understanding is that, and this links also to this question about urbanization, there is definitely, I think the change in these vocal repertoires reflects new understandings of the individual, what it means to be an individual, how you express yourself as an individual. And I think, at least for the women that I was working with, that these ideas were extremely exciting and full of promise, of progress and also of fame. Like this idea that you could become famous was, so exciting. And they loved to go to concerts and to be invited. And, this idea that maybe one day they could go abroad was, just sort of mind-blowing. They were really invested in this. So there's, these very strong promises. And at the same time, I think you're right that, it's more complicated than this. And I think, for sure for these women, they became exposed to a lot of backlash because of that. So I think there's also a sense in which you have these promises, that kind of draw people in, but then, they face extreme backlash to some extent. And there's also, I think, the way in which, in some ways, I feel like it's almost as if this kind of more modern voice, acoustically, it's almost kind of impoverished. Like it loses so much of its kind of musical potential, like all these elaborations, all this kind of, vocal, the trembles, the lamentation, all of that kind of becomes much less important because it's all about, what you say and the symbolic sort of thing of the voice. So in some ways, yeah, I think there's sort of it's almost a disenchantment, of the voice that's kind of happening there. And I think, I don't want to, it's always, from the out, also I'm not the one to judge. So I think everyone has to find their own way through this. But I think it's important to, see exactly also kind of what gets lost in this kind of scene that can so easily just be celebrated as empowerment or, yeah. So I think you're definitely right. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. We have another question up the back, please.
Thank you. I'm just a student here. I kind of wanted to ask, you touched on like the voice being modern, and of course like another word you could use to describe that is also westernized. And what I wanted to ask is sort of the relationship between like the changing of the Kurdish voice in relation to neo-coloniality, and also like not just in grasping for agency and power, like not just within Turkey, but like internationally. So like what is, you know, the role of the international, like the Western observer as well?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think there's many layers to this, in the sense that there's definitely, I think, this one. So as I mentioned, one sort of big actor, I think, that has pushed for Kurdish women's voices to become audible has been the Kurdish political movement, which is a socialist leftist secular movement, which has pushed for this. But there's also a very strong civil society sector that's funded by Western, by mainly Western kind of institutions, the EU, and they have invested so much in, these kind of gender mainstreaming NGOs, women's NGOs, and this kind of stuff. And that definitely is a huge force in kind of drawing out women, or kind of celebrating women's voices in a certain way, in a very liberal kind of way, precisely as, empowerment, agency, and this kind of thing. And we also have, as I think the third big player is the Turkish state. The Turkish state and its discourse, a kind of older secular Kemalist idea about women's rights, and what it means to be a modern kind of Republican woman, to which, having a voice belongs to that. And so there are a lot of, ideas about, Kurdish women inherently silenced and suppressed, that come from a very kind of, nationalist and racialized discourse that comes from the kind of Turkish central state. So I think there's like there are different discourses that have slightly different, that have sort of different ideological positions. There's more kind of a liberal Western civil society discourse. There's a Kurdish political movement, which is a kind of leftist socialist discourse, and then you have the kind of Turkish state as this, the kind of Kemalist authoritarian discourse, where I think these are different ways in which kind of almost these discourses interpolate or kind of incite people to raise their voices in different ways, and they kind of give different kind of value to these voices. So I think the Kurdish women's voice in some ways becomes audible at the intersection of these different discourses, and so I think there's definitely, what you would describe as a kind of coloniality or neo-coloniality is definitely one aspect in how these voices, how Kurdish women are kind of encouraged to raise their voices in order to prove that they're, civilized, and, that Kurdish society is civilized. And so there, it gives different value to voices. And I think that makes it all the more complex, because, sort of as soon as women actually kind of raise their voices, they become, it's not an innocent step. In some ways, you're sort of entangled within these political discourses that all valorize the voice in different ways. So yeah, I think these are kind of the framing actors that kind of almost incite voices and make them become audible, and then, kind of give value and meaning to them once they become audible, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you everyone. Well, we'll draw things to a close. Many congratulations on the book, and such a brilliant, original and important book, and thank you so much for giving so generously of your time tonight. It was a really wonderful presentation and Q&A. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Thanks. Great to see you here, and huge thanks to our speaker.